alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Brother Yusuf, Jazakallah khair. Well, you're doing an excellent job, especially in our time. We need this information to understand, number one, the true history of Palestine belong to the Muslims, not for Palestinians for sure. Brother and sister, in social media, in Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and Facebook and everything, to understand, Brother Yusuf, Palestine belong to the Muslims, not for Palestinians. Yes, I'm Palestinian, born in Gaza. It just is my country. But you, Brother Yusuf, he's American, born in America. He's American, white American. Actually, it belong to him. Sister Layla belong to him. Belong to us, all Muslim, my brother and sister. The key right now, the election coming soon. The two presidents, Kamala Harris and Trump, we're not going to, of course, we're not going to vote for them for sure, yes. But the key also, we have to speak about, to learn about our history, number one. Number two, very, very important. All public schools, no exception. All public schools, especially in California and New York, the public school, the Palestinians terrorists, no question. That in the school, the public school, and a lot of it's Muslims in the school. And not only that, that any curriculum, the majority in Sunnahfollowers, 99.99, I believe Allah knows best. Sunnahfollowers, their kids, you go to the public school. Yes, then you have to speak to your kids. What Palestine belong to whom? Everybody said it belonged to me, belong to us, not for Palestinians. And those Jews, they occupied Palestine now 75 years, almost 60 years. The war in Gaza right now, almost 1 year. Almost 1 year. And all the weapons from United States of America, France, England, and Germany, and Italy. All these weapons for what? For 36 square yard, very, very small, and 2.5 million people there in Gaza. So far, more than 500,000 got killed. Brother and sister, think right. Palestine belong to the Muslims, and listen to Brother Yusuf, and whatever Brother Yusuf said, we'll have to share. May Allah Azza wa Jal gather all of us to pray in Masjid Al-Aqsa together, inshallah. Brother Yusuf, please.
Yeah, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh to everybody watching, everybody around the world. We're privileged to be here. Part 6. Really need to think about this. We've been over pretty much at this point now over 6 hours of history here, covering this, conflict from the beginning and origins of Zionism. As always, I want to ask anyone who has not watched the previous 5 parts to please do that before you. I mean, granted, each lesson can be taken independently, but I will be referencing a lot of the other events that we've covered, just showing the trends and the patterns as we escalate into this crisis. So it really does help to gain the full total perspective by watching the previous ones before you watch this, but you still will gain some benefit. Inshallah is what we're going to cover tonight. A little bit of change of pace. We left off in 1948-49 war. We showed the territorial gains that were made. It was absolute, landslide victory, you can say, for the Zionist agenda. They would, at this point, take 78% of the original mandated Palestinian land, more than I think even they could have hoped for, so quickly. But they were making rapid advancements, shipping deals coming in from Czechoslovakia, funding their military, buying submarines, buying warships, acquiring planes from Britain, the United States. It was just all coming together as we left off with the armistice deal, the lines, and of course, Israel being recognized by the United Nations as an official nation. We talked about the second that they, joined the UN, they would immediately violate their first of very, very many resolutions within the next day by refusing and denying return of Palestinian exiles, 750,000 of them approximately, who had left, during this conflict, non-combatants farmers, civilians, women and children denied to return to their ancestral homeland. And we've made here, I've tried to keep Islam out of this discussion, as most of you have probably noticed throughout. The Sheikh obviously brought it there and there. But what I want my attention to be is that I want the secular audiences to see that from the secular argument, we win as well, of what's right and what's wrong. And I think we've done a pretty good job of demonstrating international law, who the good guys are and who the bad guys are. I know that's kind of cliche. Everything sometimes is not clear-cut good and bad. It's usually kind of shades of gray, and there's a lot of nuances and variables, but I think we pretty much established in this case, clear-cut, who the liars are, who the manipulators are, who the bad guys are, and who the good guys are from a secular perspective. So tonight we're doing something a little bit different, mentioned before. We are going to turn the tide of this conflict, the direction, and put the spotlight on Egypt for this particular episode, because it's very important as we are going to see what goes on, both through what we cover tonight, as well as what we're going to cover next week when we get to 1967. So I want Sister Layla, when she has a chance, to do what she did last week. And I want her to go to Google and Google Greater Israel and put that up on the map. Greater Israel is their ultimate goal. And I always want everybody to have an image of that map and those territories in their mind throughout this entire series to really see how everything was going according to plan. These people don't mind operating at a snail's pace. They will inch. They don't have to take miles, as we're going to see tonight. Just an inch is enough for them. They have a long-term goal and a plan, and collectively they have worked, as we have seen and will continue to see, for that ultimate goal. But I also want you to take a look at how the Arabs approached this. How the Israelis were completely singular. They were focused. They were unified. They didn't cut each other's throats. Look how the Arabs, operate, as we've already demonstrated some of this in the prior episodes. And it's going to continue as we go on, of why unity always wins more times than not. So we're going to open up with a little bit of a brief historical understanding of what the Suez Canal is. Well, starting in 1869, the construction project was jointly shared by France and Egypt. This was landmark, for the time, because you had, and we're going to get into all the issues with ground shipping opposed to boats. So you were making a little partition now that was going to link India, was going to link China, was going to allow them simply to sail up right to the Mediterranean to service trade in that area, as well as going to the western side of Western Europe. Monumental construction. Originally, the Suez Company would operate the canal. This was basically, a shared venture between French and Egyptian shareholders occupied on Egypt-controlled land. And again, groundbreaking, strategically important, as we are going to see throughout this. This played an intricate role in World War I, World War II, and obviously, as we are going to see in this particular conflict. And there, of course, Sister Leia has put up there what exactly Greater Israel is. In fact, this right here, they wear it, on their uniforms. They are telling you, and have been for quite some time, exactly where they want and what they believe belongs to them. Ain't much Syria left, isn't much Iraq left, and the area we're going to talk about tonight is also blue as well. They've wanted this. They've had it in their crosshairs for a very, very long time. When people used to scramble and scratch their heads as, why is America in Iraq? Why is America making up lies about weapons of mass destruction? That's a different talk for a different day. Look at this map. It makes sense. Exactly. Break them down, bomb them, destroy the infrastructure. You're not going to conquer them today. You're going to conquer them tomorrow. And same thing with Syria, with that phony ISIS, group that we were hearing about over a decade ago. Never attacked Israel, always attacked fellow Muslims, always attacked innocent people. Look at Syria. It's been beaten down, torn apart by war. And we are going to be referencing this throughout our session tonight. So again, back to the importance of the canal, again, linking the Mediterranean basically to India, to Far East. And again, if you think about this from a perspective when it comes to efficiency, if I'm trying to ship massive amounts of cargo from India to Central Europe to Western Europe, the amount of fuel, Trains are very limited in the amount of cargo they can carry due to having to push all that. But when you travel by sea, and sea has always been the desired form of transport and commerce, sea has always been king. You know, as we're going to see here, oil tankers, moving of energy and resources. Sea is superior. This canal opened up an amazing opportunity to increase efficiency, increase trade, and for the colonial powers, this was big because it linked New Zealand, it linked Austria, it linked their controlled territories of India and Pakistan, China, all basically to their control of Egypt, and of course to the new Zionist state, as well as to Southern and Western Europe. So this thing was a big deal. And we get into one of those not so much of a coincidence. Shortly after the construction, no coincidence, Egypt would have a debt crisis and was forced to sell their shares for $4 million to the British government. This is about an equivalent of about 430 million today in today's dollars. Not a small chunk of change here. And the reigning majority would still be in the hands of the French investors. So the French investors would control about 54%. You know, you would have about 46% basically of the shares would be in the British hands now. So this is what they do. When someone asked me a long time ago, what do you think their greatest weapon is? I said, it's an easy answer. I'll give it to you in 1 second. It's paper money. When you're able to create money like that out of thin air, you can accomplish anything. You can put nations in debt, overthrow their leaders, fund anyone you want, overthrow coup d'etats, the whole 9 yards. Paper money is the game changer. Paper money has been used to create debt, and what they do, then they go in and they buy up your assets, and they bring them into their collective. Look at the United States. I lived in Saudi Arabia. You know, I saw how cheap oil and gas was, how cheap it was for electricity there. We have more oil than them, but yet we pay an arm and a leg. Why? Because everything was allowed to be privatized. You know, here, all of our public utilities are privatized. All of our oil and gas is in the hands of private companies. This is how they run things. They go in, they buy you up by getting you in debt, and the only way to get out of debt is give them things of value, land, resources, and things like that. So they buy up your asset, and again, they take control. This is pure exploitation. It is modern colonialism. It's done throughout all Western countries. We don't own a thing. The people benefit nothing from the amount of oil that we have here. We have so much oil, and yet zero benefits. Our electrical bills are through the roof. You know, when I was living in Saudi, first time I filled up my car, I think it was $3 to $4. You know, I was joking. I was like, I can't get a gallon at the time when Barack Obama was in office. So again, this is what they do. They get you in debt, and then now they've seized control of the canal. The UK would eventually take control of Egypt officially in 1882. The British would take full control, obviously, of the canal with respect still to the French shareholders. As always, we show you the greater picture before explaining the future conflicts. This is undisputed history. We are going to see who's in the wrong. This is Egyptian land. It's the people's project. They paid for it. But again, we see how it was usurped or taken, you know, like from them. Who's in whose land? Was there any justification for the UK to take control of Egypt? No, absolutely not. And when these people come on the TV and they try to lecture, you know, anyone about morality or decency or right versus wrong, we just have an endless list of these type of stories of them being in other people's lands, exploiting them, taking their resources, including that of their own people. The British people were the first victims. And then they took their dog and pony show on the road and brought it to the Arab world and to many other places. But we never lose track that the white British were the original first victims of this particular British cartel, just like the American people have been the first victims of this cartel here. So in 1888, we have what we call the Convention of Constantinople. This would declare that the canal, due to its importance, the emergence of oil, how important it was to get oil around the world. So this was going to be a big deal. It had to be neutral. A neutral zone the international community could benefit from, and it would be maintained and governed by you-know-who, the empire ruling power of the time, Great Britain. The Ottoman Empire would even permit free movement and trade through the canal in accordance with the international agreements. The Ottomans still had not fallen yet. We talked about that in part one, how one of the major goals of World War I was to reduce Ottoman influence, to get rid of it, turn the Arabs against their Muslim brothers, despite differences, and side, of course, the ultimate goals of the Zionists. So again, we see, and we've seen this throughout the series, and you're going to see it tonight. Agreements mean absolutely nothing to these people. Honor code, whatever you want, being a man of your word, zero meaning to these people. They don't mind telling you one thing on Monday and doing the complete opposite on Friday. And as we are going to see and already now have, first incident of that happening tonight. So agreements mean nothing again. During World War I, the British would, again, what would they do? They cut off assets from the canal to all the non-allied countries. Germany and Ottoman forces would attempt to seize it, which caused the British to really show how important this canal was. They sent 100,000 troops there to secure it. So they're out here saying, don't worry, when we get it, it's going to stay neutral. It's going to stay open. First chance they get, bang, close. You can't use it. And then we're going to see later when they cry foul when it's done to their pal over there in the Middle East, the Zionists. They didn't like it then, but they're certainly fine with doing it to the Ottomans in World War I. They were certainly fine using this as leverage in World War II. And they signed treaties, break them, doesn't matter. We said Israel joins the UN, they break the first resolution in a matter of days. So as the demand for oil is now increasing, the canal became even more important than it was in the late 1800s. You know, Europe would come to import about 2 million barrels of oil per day. Well, much more now, obviously, but this is an emerging industrialization going on. The need for oil and all of its products and properties was becoming very important. Just from the Middle East alone, they would take 1.2 million through that canal. So it had to be in Western hands. We're going to show later the consequences of what happened briefly when it wasn't. This would have crippled them. This would have killed their currency, their productivity, everything. This canal had to remain in Western hands. No ifs, ands, or buts. No amount of death mattered. It was imperative number one. So you had in 1952 the Egyptian takeover, revolution, overthrowing basically Western puppet, who was there at the time. Also, you had the Cold War. Now was around 1952. The Cold War was starting to get to its infancy. So you see a new directive, new perspective, basically coming around in the region. So you would have several key factors that put increasing need on this canal. The Cold War, as I mentioned, the Arab Cold War, which was a struggle for power between who was going to have the leadership position in the Arab world. You had, different leaders from Jordan, obviously, we've talked about Ford Hussein, people from Iraq, obviously, we're going to talk about today Nasser in Egypt. And then you had Arab nationalists also in there who were wanting basically the colonial powers out. They were wanting a return to Arab people being in charge of the Arab destiny within their lands, and also a call to return, of course, to more Islamic-based societies. And then you got the big conflict, which this series is focused on, at the same time, the, of course, Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So in 1953, it was agreed for Britain to terminate their rule of Sudan. In 1957, in return for Cairo to agree to what they call suzerainty. Suzerainty basically means that you're a puppet state, but not all the way a puppet state. You have some rights, but ultimately your destiny is still controlled by others. They wanted that to stay in British hands, half independence, but not total sovereign control, if you will. The British would also have 12 months in this deal to evacuate all troops with a right of return under a period of 7 years. The Suez Company would officially be given to Egypt in 1968. As Nasser came to power, direction was changing. Britain was being, they felt being forced out. And this was a problem for them. They gave some concessions, of course, terminating their rule, but not complete sovereignty would be given over to the Egyptian people. Again, kind of stealth colonialism, if you will. So Gamal Nasser became the president of Egypt and was particularly concerned with the Hashemite kingdoms of Iraq and Jordan, as we've looked at already before in this series, and their allegiance to the British. At this point in time, the very Jordanian military would still be led by British commanders. We saw what Hussein had done with changing Arab plans in the beginning of the war in 1948, which was detrimental to the Arab chances they had of hitting Israel while the iron was hot. We've already seen questionable things from this family, still to this day, obviously, by the way. And Nasser was obviously concerned. with this, and felt there was some big issues that's going to have to be dealt with internally, as well as the colonial power. The soul of the Arabs, was at stake in the eyes of Nasser. Assassination attempts made on him with the presence of the British still in the region was very unsettling. So you've got people trying to kill him. You've got basically the British are still heavily present. And then you have this, obviously elephant in the room of this newly formed state of Israel, which has 78% at this time of the mandated Palestinian territories. You're seeing, again, Arab puppet regimes are starting to pop up. All this stuff is the groundwork for what we see now. It's just in its infancy in this point. Someone is trying to at least stop it. Was his motivations pure intently? I don't know. I'm not in his heart. We're just reporting historical facts of what he did. And what he truly, his agenda was, we'll never know. But some of his actions, as we're seeing, obviously, were very, at least on the surface level, very beneficial. He wanted full Egyptian independence, and the future of the region was at stake. In this, Egypt was the most populous of all the Arab countries. It had the biggest military, the biggest force. We're going to get to the ineptness of the military in a little bit, but it was still a slight power in comparison to the newly emerging Saudi Arabia, who had just formed a few decades prior, which was not obviously to where it is now. Other Gulf states were literally fractions of what they would later become. So Egypt was still at this time kind of the superpower, if you will, of the Arab world. So other influences that came in, to the region, American interest in the region had intensified due to the conflict with the Soviets and the Cold War. So because, again, what I just mentioned about Egypt, they were at the center of this. America wanted its own interest, along with Zionist interests, as we're going to see later. But first thing, they wanted to make sure that Soviet influence did not spread to the region. So you found basically several things coming from America. One of them was the Middle East Defense Organization. They wanted the headquarters for this to be based in Egypt. This was the NATO of the Middle East, which was going to surround the Soviet Union and basically make sure that arms, whatnot, could not flow in, that there would be no Russian influence spreading, throughout the region. So a NATO, if you will, of the Arab world. The United States policy, again, was to persuade the Arabs, just forget about Israel. Don't worry about it anymore. Come with us, unite against the common Soviet enemy. Even though the Russians at this point in time had never really infringed. They sold arms to Israel, sure, through Czechoslovakia. We chronicled that before. They also sold arms to the Arabs, as well. Russia obviously was more pro-Zionist than they were pro-Arab, but this was kind of the way America was really directing things, was you need to be with us against the Soviets in this new Cold War. In fact, John Foster Dulles, one of the big Dulles CIA family, an airport's named after him in Washington, D.C., when you look at the Kennedy assassination, this name pops up time and time again. Not clean people, by any means. But he was shocked that the Arab states were more fearful of the Zionists than the communists. Is there a difference? The Zionists are the ones that created communism in Russia. If you go look up who the Bolsheviks, who the ruling commissars were in Russia, who Vladimir Lenin was, who Lev Bronstein, known as Leon Trotsky in the West, who Mordecai Levy, known as Karl Marx, who wrote the book on communism, the Communist Manifesto. Karl Marx's name was Mordecai Levy. Changed it, obviously, to fit in with German society, and the media will say he's a German, and we know that. So is there really a difference? The Arabs saw the fear at the doorstep. They weren't concerned with the fear 20 houses down. You're concerned with what you're obviously dealing with here. So due to the CIA coup of King Farouk that happened, as I mentioned before, with the overthrow in 52, CIA wanted him out of there. The CIA viewed Nasser as an asset, of theirs, someone they could work with. The British knew, also of these ties, obviously, and resented it, as they saw American imperialism was infringing upon their dying, fledgling empire that was going down. They saw now America was the one that had the money and the resources to orchestrate the coups that the British used to do. Not like the British were the saintly figures. Now, they did do some good things in terms of favoring some issues with Palestine, not all, obviously, but they were a little bit better in that area, but their history is obviously as bloody as it gets. The CIA would offer Nasser $3 million bribe to join this defense organization, the NATO of the Middle East, and 3 million at that time. Calculated for inflation, we're looking at, probably 40, 50 million. I'm just guessing on the top of my head based on percentages. A lot of money given to him basically to join this organization. He took the money, but then later refused to join. And this is something the Zionists would have done, no question about it. Agree, take the money, and then say, no, I'm not going to comply with that. So we can't really fault Nasser for playing by the same rules that we saw being played against the Muslim and Arab world for decades prior to this. And say one thing on Mondays, I always said, say something different on Tuesday. I'm with you, takes the money, pockets it. No thanks, guys, I'm not going to do it. And he was clear he wanted Egypt to dominate this organization, which would be informally associated with the United States. So Egypt would be the liaison, in the region, if you will, and they would be the kind of central figure. He did not want this going to the Hashemite families in Iraq and Jordan. Americans viewed the best policy to look towards states of Turkey, Iran, Pakistan, and they would be the best to facilitate peace in the region. They were the northern blocks of states. They had very strategical locations that America could get air bases in. America still at the time, obviously later on, would get bases in Turkey, and they would start their reconnaissance and spy missions on the Soviets. In fact, my uncle was in the military. He was in Turkey, back in the 1980s when the height of the Cold War was almost to the end. The peak had already come down. So very big strategical points that America had made, around there to increase their influence. In early 55, the Baghdad Pact would be signed with Pakistan, Iran, Turkey, UK, and Iraq, while the conclusion was almost at the same time. So you have this going on over here, this new Cold War alliance. Don't worry about Israel over here. That it's fine. Nothing's going to happen anymore. Just join together. Simultaneously, while this is going on, Israel launched operations against the Gaza Strip on February 28th, 1955. A familiar figure to people who know the state of Israel, a man by the name of Ariel Sharon. That's the first of many times he's going to be mentioned over the coming weeks. If you look up devil in the dictionary, you might see a picture that looks like this guy. And if anyone has seen him, Allah really put the mark on this man. You could see the evil, a mile away. And some of the atrocities that he was involved in, we are going to chronicle, later, also later Prime Minister of Israel. So he would lead an attack on Egyptian forces and basically in the Gaza Strip. So Egypt's like, okay, on one hand, you're trying to say, don't worry about Israel, get together, let's be his Middle East NATO equivalent. And now you still got the same stuff going on, over here, the same raids, the same attacks. Our soldiers are getting targeted, ceasefire. Nothing was going on. And of course, the excuse, conveniently, there's terrorists in there, as we've often come to know, as cliche as night and day. So again, he would see this as Nasser would see this as another attempt to minimize his power, shifting Arab influence to Iraq, this agreement that had been made, also the fearfulness of further Israeli attacks. Nasser wanted a relationship with America in order to purchase significant weapons. Obviously, he knew what he was doing, at least on this level. He knew how much arms the Zionists were getting from Czechoslovakia. Obviously, Britain wasn't going to supply much. America was a big arms supplier, starting to emerge as a big one and become later the most dominant in the world in that area. So due to direct pressure, Eisenhower would not accommodate this. It was very difficult to get the Zionist-controlled media in America to convince the public and lobbying, of course, of the Congress and the senators to actually agree to give arms to a nation that was openly anti-Zionist. Nasser was known for anti-Zionist speeches. Rhetoric was coming in and out from his government. There were radio shows. It was all over the regime. And the Zionists obviously were not going to be comfortable with this. So they used their influence in America through the media to basically bribing and lobbying politicians to not give this approval. So there will also, while this is going on, we have another issue, which is a declaration between France, UK, and the US that they would not shift the balance of power. Uneven weapons sales would not be allowed. This was a trilateral agreement among three parties. They reviewed, okay, if we're going to arm Israel, you have to arm the Palestinians or Egyptians with the same quantities. We are going to stay impartial in this. We're not going to be, going there. So Nasser basically reached out with Nikita Khrushchev, the president of basically Russia, and secured arm deals. Khrushchev was willing to supply unlimited amounts of arms through Czechoslovakia to then flood into Egypt. So now Israel is seeing change in Russian regime, not as beneficial to Zionists as previous regimes. And now Egypt's going to start getting some weapons too. It was all the Zionists before. We're going to talk about the French and the British and how quickly they broke those agreements, as we see commonly too many times. But now Israel's a little bit concerned because now the playing field may be even, and Egypt has a much larger surplus population that would be capable of waging war. So if you could overturn the balance of the uneven in technology, weaponry, and aircraft, there might be a shot here. So in this part now, we're going to look at the escalation of the ultimate war that would break out here in the next year. So prior to the attack in 1955, Nasser had tried to reach peace efforts with Israel, help preventing cross-border attacks by Palestinian rebels, in turn again for peace. You know, he would do the best he could to prevent any retaliation from the Fedayeen and Palestinian groups. In turn, Israel would also oblige on him. So after the attack by Sharon's forces, this became, okay, what's going on here? Let's, again, let's sit down and try to work things out. So he would allow, basically, and facilitate the creation of the Fedayeen bases in Gaza, Jordan, and Lebanon. So he tried to reach out to the table. We talked about previously, Sharon, impromptu, no reason, no justification, attacked, injured Egyptian forces. Nasser was like, okay, what am I going to do now with these people? I mean, no agreement means anything. So he started allowing and facilitating this growth in Gaza and surrounding territories. So now we would see the coming of a French-Israel alliance that would strengthen following the Algerian War. French officials would tell Shimon Peres, who later became an Israel prime minister as well, they were prepared to sell Israel any weapons that it needed to buy. They would totally disregard the prior declaration, as I just mentioned a few seconds ago. So here you go. They signed agreement 2 weeks later, 3 months later, doesn't matter. We're going to give you everything you need. Once they saw the Russians were giving, Egypt these deals, it became very important that you had to stop this. So Israelis informed the French that they intended to declare war in Egypt due to fears of Soviet weapons would turn the tide. Israel obviously wanted the canal. They obviously needed an excuse. They didn't want to wait. They felt they had to hit Egypt as soon as possible in order to properly take over this territory. Nasser would make further enemies by using influence to form an Arabization of the Jordan Army Command. The commander, John Bagot Glub, who was known as Glub Pasha by the Arabs, who's a British commander, headed basically the Royal Jordanian Army, he would be sacked, and fired under pressure, riots breaking out, in Jordan. You had riots coming basically against the Baghdad Pact throughout the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan and Iraq. Hussein felt basically that my throne is his exact words, is under siege. Egypt is using their power, buying influence. We're seeing commanders being thrown out, British influence being removed. My own people are sympathizing with them, not with my crown and my throne. He's seeing the pressure, mounting on him, and all these people care about at the end of the day is their throne and their power. As we still can see, nothing matters to them more than this. In January of 56, Eisenhower would make a major effort for peace between Israel and the Arab states. Large quantities of aid would be given out in exchange for this peace. Nasser insisted Palestine is his first thing he said, not about paying me, not about anything else. He insisted that Palestinians be given the right of return, or, and this is a key for the Arab leaders now, or settlement in surrounding Arab states. So if the Palestinians had already made a home there, they could be there. They would be given rights and respected and stay within these Arab states. If they wanted to return, they would be given right to return. Nasser also wanted annexing the southern half of Israel, which was mandated Palestine under the original agreement. Then later white papers would be published giving that area to Egypt. Israel seized it in 48 and 49. He also wanted that, but he refused direct talks because of fear of assassination. And can you blame him? These are the same people that killed UN peacekeepers, assassinated him in broad daylight, They have no issues with doing that again. So he refused also as part of his terms to meet there in person in a direct accord with these guys. I don't blame him. I certainly wouldn't have gone there myself either. So again, though, look what he asked for and where we're at still this day. We are in 2024, and these Palestinians are still not allowed to return. And they still can't get citizenship in these Arab countries. Not Lebanon, not Syria, not Egypt, not Saudi, obviously, or any GCC, countries. None of them allow these people to have a decent life. Palestinian family grows up in Saudi. It's very difficult for them even to send their kids in universities, because those are Saudi-only spots. Where are we going to send them? I don't have a home. I'm going to send them to college in Gaza? It's not going to happen. Obviously can't go there. So, again, we're still facing this to this day. And this man was trying to correct it during that time. He was also reluctant to side with the West in the Cold War, as he should have been. This is not our fight. This is a fight between one totalitarian dictatorship, communism on the other, and then you've got total totalitarian, phony capitalism on the other. Neither one benefits the people. The end result, slavery on both sides. So again, what's the benefit for Muslims to take part in such conflict? Zero. Both lead to the same place. The capitalism just leads to an illusion that you're free. With the communism, you see it. You see the bars. With capitalism, the bars are invisible. You have to try to cross them to feel the obstructions. In July of 26, Nasser would nationalize. Now, this was the final shot. He made a lot of demands. Zionists and British and French didn't like it. Now he nationalized the Suez Canal. All assets of the Suez Canal would be frozen. Stakeholders, and this again, I say what you will about Nasser. I said I have basically what I'm outlining today, overall favorable view. Stakeholders would be paid for their shares according to the closing price in the French stock exchange on that day. So even when he nationalized this, he still had enough respect of decency to give the investors their money as it was valued at the closing of the day he nationalized it. We're going to see later when the Zionists pull out of an area what they do. We've seen already before how the Zionists treat property of other people, houses they built, roads they built. We see the respect that they showed. But we see here again the noble, honorable thing. This is Egyptian land. It should belong to the Egyptian people, the Egyptian government. And we're going to give you what you invested. You're going to get the value of your investment. I'm nationalizing it. So completely fair and reasonable. It is their country, their resources. But he would also do something that could not stand. He would close the canal to Israel and all Israeli shipping, as well as the Straits of Tiran, and he would blockade the Gulf of Aqaba. So not only he closed the canal, but he closed the entire entry point into that area. This was a declaration of war. This was not going to be allowed to stand. Obviously, this would have broken them. Obviously, it would have broken the Western influence, splitting up the Commonwealth territories we're going to look at here in a minute. So the Prime Minister, Anthony Edwin, immediately was hosting a dinner with King Faisal II of Iraq and his Prime Minister, Nuri Assad. And they urged the UK to hit Nasser hard. Here, this is again the loyalty, isn't it? You've got a king and his Prime Minister, supposedly Muslim, of an Arab country, encouraging basically the British, the colonizing nation, the kuffar, the non-believers, to hit them hard. And let's just remove Islam from this. Let's remove religion, from this. From a moral standpoint, Article 22 says mandated Palestine belongs to the Arab people. Again, I have to mention that almost every episode. It was a Class A mandate. So you leave religion out, they're wrong there too. But these two men encouraging basically him to do it. What did Egypt do wrong? They took their territory, would belong to them. The Zionists had been attacking their men. The Zionists had shot British planes down. They attacked diplomats. They were illegally occupying territory that was against the against the League of Nations. So what did they do wrong? Can't really make a case for it of anything that they did wrong here. And now we're going to see the first time, maybe wrong, this is the first time I've seen it, We're only right now, we're basically about 9 years removed from World War II. The first comparison to Hitler. This is the Zionist favorite tactic. Everybody's been Hitler. I've seen so many Hitlers in my lifetime. Saddam Hussein was Hitler. They were teaching me that when I was 10 years old in schools. Gaddafi was Hitler. They've called anyone who ever dares to stand up against them Hitler. Well, the first person, to my knowledge, I may be wrong, but the first person is Nasser of Egypt. They called him Hitler. And they said he's trying to take over the world. We've heard that again, famously Saddam, Kim of Korea. We hear it from Gaddafi, Noriega in Panama. I mean, it just Castro in Cuba. It just goes on and on and on, And they've used it so much, it has no meaning now, anymore. But he, to my knowledge, was the first. So Britain is realizing now the urgency of being denied access of oil. This is a big deal. This is going to destroy them. Yvonne Kirkpatrick, who's the undersecretary of the Foreign Office, would state that lack of access to oil would cause gold reserves to disappear, and the British would not be able to properly fund their military, any of their territories. I mean, it would have been a domino effect, which would have wreaked havoc across the British economy. But the British, on one hand, also feared angering the United States because the United States had a stake in this Cold War unity that they were trying to get against the Soviets. So they concluded with a secret agreement between France and Israel that they were going to regain control of the canal against the knowledge of the Americans. They had to do something because they saw the clock ticking. The shipments were not going to be able to get there. They were not going to be able to trade with India. They were not going to be able to get Arab oil, anymore. And I mentioned last week, imagine if our leaders today had the guts of Nasser. If they had half the guts of Nasser, this Palestinian nonsense that's going on right now could have been stopped in a day, in half a day, in an hour, if just action would have been taken. We control the Muslim world, so many resources that we've allowed to just go to others and been used and weaponized, against us because of these greedy leaders. The French Prime Minister Guy Mollet would state that Nasser will not get his way. On July 29, 1956, the French cabinet decided officially, we're going to war. There must be military action. So the Commonwealth nations, particularly Australia and New Zealand, they had a big stake in this because they relied on the canal for their trade, with Western Europe, both ways. So you found aid was lended by New Zealand and Australia to this conflict. They had a stake in the game. Eisenhower from the United States side would openly oppose the use of force and convened international nations to build support for the canal to be deemed international and remain open. Granted, different president, but they didn't do this in World War I or World War II when the canal was closed in times of war. They didn't tell everybody to make it international when the British had no problem closing it to the Ottomans and closing it to the Germans. No problem. Then they sent 100,000 troops, as we previously discussed, to reinforce that. But now that it was being weaponized against them, now, no, we got to come together, guys. We got to have a deal, and the usual rhetoric that you come to expect. The British and French used this negotiation as valuable time to build. Both these nations were still recovering from losing colonial control from World War II. They needed some time extra to get their stuff going and be ready for this invasion. Britain and France obviously viewed the weakening of their image and global standing. They wanted Nasser out. They wanted to, return that mystique and that aura. They're the French. They're the British. You don't mess with them. But a new kid was on the block, run by its master, another new of Israel and the United States. And they were kind of, taking over that from these old powers. So Israel, again, also, as they always have, we've seen, they viewed this too as an opportunity to expand territory and power. They wanted to weaken Egypt to prevent them from growing arms and a military stockpile, because as we saw with Greater Israel, there were things that Israel expects to be theirs, that they want. They don't care how long it takes to get it, but they're going to do it one brick at a time. So the British, French, and Israeli forces would be upgraded during this period of time, equipped and well-trained. Now, the Egyptian forces, and then we're going to stop here to focus on this too, would suffer what Arab nations suffer from to this day. I spent almost 9 years living in the Arab world. One of the biggest problems I saw was what they call wasta. Wasta, basically anyone who knows Arabic knows that culture is favoritism, nepotism. While the French, Israelis, the Western powers are giving people jobs based on merits, Arabs have a problem in their culture. I got to give my job to my Habibi over here, my friend, my uncle, my cousin. It doesn't matter if he's qualified or not. In fact, when I was working in the Gulf, I used to have a joke I said with my co-workers. I said, the boss would bring an Egyptian in who couldn't talk and couldn't read or write and give him more money than us if he could. If corporate above him would condone that, because that's how he hired. That's how he operated. And what we see here, appointments in the Egyptian army being based completely on the influence you had, not on the merit. One example of this, the Field Marshal Abdul Hakim Amr was a heavy drinker. And this is a Muslim, supposedly, heavy drinker of alcohol, completely incompetent, but was put in place because he was friends with Nasser. So even that high up, it's still a disease that affects this culture, is separating basically, merit from friendship. I told a person once, when it comes to work, I have a job to do. I'd fire my own mother if she wasn't performing. This is some Western mentality that, we have, and this is to the detriment. When you put people in positions of power and authority who have no business commanding troops, and we're going to see, as we've always seen, when Egypt fights Israel or the West, they got completely destroyed during this period of time due to the incompetency, lack of training, lack of tactics, not being updated to modern military tactics, and always being behind. So again, the crisis is going, and I'm going to quote a Zionist here from the United States named Rahm Emanuel. Rahm Emanuel worked in the Obama administration. He famously said, never let a good opportunity go to waste. So Israel, of course, would not, miss out on this opportunity to do what? Its favorite thing in the world, massacre Palestinian civilians. So even though they have nothing to do with this, Israel's like, okay, we have an excuse now. We're going to go kill some more civilians, take some more villages. So you had what we called the Khan Yunis massacre, would see the IDF, as usual, coming in there, killing 275 Palestinian civilians. This would go on November 3rd, 1956. When asked about this, as usual, there were terrorists in there. We had to go in there and kill all the civilians. Literally, they went door to door, massacring people everywhere they could. 275, Palestinians. And like I said, they never let a good opportunity go to waste. It's times of war. Let's do what we do best, and that's go in and massacre some civilians. And sure enough, they did it again. As the fighting would intensify, obviously the Allied forces would win this victory very decisively. The death toll would be 22 British dead, 96 wounded, 10 French would die, 33 wounded, 172 Israel dead. They did most of the ground fighting on the eastern theater of this, 817 wounded, and between 1,000 to 3,000 Egyptians were dead. Some say it's 3,000, some say 1. Depends on the sources that you look at. So I just go with estimates, usually in the middle of that. We could probably safely say around 2,000, with over 4,000 wounded. Highly successful military operation, but disastrous at the time internationally. The Allies got what they wanted. They went in, they took control. They got the canal back opened again. But this did bring a lot of international condemnation. We would see protests in rather calm areas erupting all over the Muslim world. Pakistan would have 300,000 people attend, condemning the British, setting the tone for future developments in that country. King Saud of Saudi Arabia now would launch an oil embargo on Britain and France. We're missing that today. Obviously, he stepped up. Overall, this was very tough to defend because, as I highlighted previously, was Egypt in the wrong here? This was their land. They paid the shareholders fairly. Israel had obviously attacked their, people without provocation. They were retaliating. And they wanted British presence removed from their country. They have that right. No one has a, right to rule over another people. So an emergency session, as the fighting would intensify, an emergency session was called on November the 1st in the UN General Assembly. The session would follow the U.S. proposal of Resolution 997, which called for an immediate ceasefire, withdrawal of the forces behind the armistice lines of 1945, arms embargoes on both sides to stop the fighting, and the reopening of the canal. Ben-Gurion would address the Knesset on November the 7th, so you're having basically his address 6 days later after this, and declare a great victory for the cause of Zionism and the Jewish state, saying the 1949 armistice lines no longer valid, and all agreements with Egypt were dead and buried. Remember, they have that legislation I talked about in a prior video where we showed how they already said territory that belongs to them ain't going anywhere. They're not giving it back. You know, it belongs to them. He's saying, I'm not respecting the armistice lines. This is ours. He made intentions to annex the Sinai Peninsula, which we saw, and Sister Layla put that graph up earlier. This was their intent all along. But after U.S. pressure and 4 months of struggle, for one time, you'd see Israel actually back down on something. Resolution 1002 would again call for withdrawal behind the armistice lines. Ben-Gurion would inform Eisenhower that he would agree to withdraw. Eisenhower, was he some hero of the Arab world? Was he a hero of the Muslims? Absolutely not. As we're going to see here later, Eisenhower is a little bit more calm. The Zionists, sometimes their blood gets up and they just want to massacre and kill at will. We've seen that time and time again. Eisenhower, no. This is bad. Wait. It'll come. And it's more of a patient approach that you can see here. A lot of rioting, a lot of loss of societal control, possibly in Jordan, possibly in Iraq. We already saw 300,000 in Pakistan. British people were against, they had enough of war. The British public was tired, exhausted, poor. They were tired of this. They'd gone through World War I, World War II. Now they were going to send troops, in the Middle East to fight again. You're finding all of that. It had to stop. And the U.S. was a lot more calm. U.S. would put economic pressure on France and England to get them to stop, threatening to sell the sterling bonds, as well as NATO also threatening to refuse oil sales. And this would have ended it for them. It would have plunged the British pound. They would not have been able to get the resources. It would have been a bad deal, for them. So the United States was like, guys, you've got to pull out. In a classic Zionist move, however, Israel would always do what they do, and they agreed to some of it. They did pull out after pressure, but they refused to host UN troops to keep an eye on them. And they would systematically, before they leave, I mentioned this, I kind of alluded to it earlier when I showed how the Egyptians treated the shareholders. This is how the Zionists treat you when they pull out. They destroyed all the infrastructure in the peninsula. They destroyed the railways, completely eradicated them. Telephone lines, anyone that was standing was taken down. All the houses would be burned and destroyed. And they would seize basically 6 trains, a 30-ton crane that they would use for their own railroads. So as a typical Zionist, we couldn't expect anything. It would be disappointing, actually, if they didn't do something like this. But that's what they did as they pulled out. So Egypt would come out of this for a time, as the victor. Nasser would emerge as a hero in the Arab world, despite the mediocre combat performance, lack of management, coordination, and fighting skills of the army. He still was someone who had the guts to stand up to the colonial powers of the day and fight back. 25,000 Jews would be expelled from Egypt, allowing 1 suitcase, small sums of cash only. All their property would be handed over to the Egyptian government. Now, I've heard this particular incident cited by Zionists all the time as, look what Islam does to minorities. Look what Islam does to the people of the book. But they never mention what exactly these guys were doing for internal sabotage. They never mention what they did when they captured Palestinian civilians. They didn't even give them a suitcase. They didn't give them any money. They burned everything. And they made them march barefoot across the hot desert in one occasion, we saw. They massacred them, half of them in the others. So, this was as hospitable a excavation or evacuation as you could ever see. So, again, we see the morals there. But the war would do something that, again, was all part of the plan from the Israeli side. it instilled the confidence. They got to feel Egypt out. Like a boxing match, when you go in the first round, you're kind of feeling what the guy's got. Can the other guy hurt me? This was kind of how the Zionists looked at this war. Can Egypt fight me? Can they hurt us? And they felt after this, absolutely not. That if Israel fought Egypt with their hands not tied, that it would be a resounding victory. They were able to figure that out at this point in time. And they get stronger. The greater agenda would go on, as we're going to look at in the next part in 67. Eisenhower would later state, that he thought maybe...
Can I speak about Egypt and Abdel Nasser and the Jews in that time in Egypt? In fact, in the time of Abdel Nasser, the moment Jamal Abdel Nasser became president for Egypt, the Jewish actually have an organization to destroy Egypt at that time.
Mm-hmm.
That's why the army, they tried to arrest those people to be away out of Egypt. In fact, the whole area with many streets in Cairo, especially in Cairo and Alexandria, with the street of the Jews. There's no problem. But the Jews in that time in Egypt, they tried to make propaganda and uprising against the president. Why? Because the king before Abdel Nasser, King Farouk, it was king make a place, special places for them. Of course, King Farouk, the British. King Farouk, who became Farouk? That the British. That's why they have a place in Egypt for the Jews in that time. And they consider themselves, they are from Musa and Harun. They consider that. So that's why that when Abdel Nasser come, they tried to get him out of Egypt. That's why England, they occupied Palestine and Egypt in that time. England. And that's why England gave to the Jews in the 1948. They started from 48 to give the Jews Palestine for them. And exactly 75 years, 76 almost years right now. Sorry, Brother Yusuf, for interruption.
Oh, no worries. Absolutely. I kind of alluded to that. You went a little bit more detail on it. Again, when you talk about self-sabotage, the Zionists always tell you the first line of the story, and they leave out the next 10 paragraphs as to why. They give you the first bit, they give you the end. They were Jews, they were expelled, and then they leave all those documents and evidences out, to portray themselves again as this perpetual victim. When you investigate, you find out, you see exactly what Sheikh was saying, what they were doing there. And again, this was another sign that this conflict of things to come, the greater aspirations of Israel, they felt their enemy out. They felt, okay, we know we got this. It's just a matter of time. And as we're going to move on to the next part next week, we are going to look at 1967. And we are going to look at the Israeli Zionist further advancement of the agenda, another war. We'll go into detail and pick that one apart as well. We'll be introduced to some new figures, obviously in this story that are going to emerge. And yes, we will stop here.
Jazakallah khair, Brother Yusuf. May Allah gather all of us with Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam in Jannah, and all of us, may Allah make us go pray in Masjid al-Aqsa together, Ya Rab. Ameen, ameen, Ya Rab.